I realised I'm going to get a million response videos from JF and alt-hype and stuff like this.
And that was the one true thing he said the whole video. Now, Sargon engages in some race deconstructionism. It's very stupid, and as high energy as that intro is, I'm not too energized about making this response, but I sort of feel obligated to. Because first, it's stuff I've dealt with tens of times before, and second off, I'm not sure if Sargon really believes what he's saying. And he may just saying it because he wants people to believe that he doesn't consider Mediterraneans white, and this is related to his claims about being black, which morphed into claims of him being non-white.
That I have to actually look back and observe and study and understand.
Well, you'd be surprised, actually. My dad isn't white.
Mm-hmm.
So my granddad wasn't white, and he was a black man in the 60s who married my white grandmother. And my father is his son, his oldest son, and then I'm my father's oldest son. So, okay, I might look quite white, but if you would see a sort of a genealogy of my family, it's not. And it's very interesting, like, and I love this. Listen to this. The tricky thing is that even if his grandfather was actually himself only a quarter black, he'd still refer to him as black. My grandfather wasn't a quarter black. He was fully black. So who the hell knows how much black DNA he actually has? I went in this alt-right hangout, and, there were like 8 of them and me, and my grandfather's black on my dad's side.
I watched alt-hype's video today, and he made the argument that you are not being completely honest, that you are part black.
I don't know what race he actually was, because it was never something I really cared about. I mean, he was a very dark-skinned man, but I don't think he was sub-Saharan. I never really thought about it, because I didn't care. I don't know, West Indian or something maybe?
Yeah.
I just don't know. My grandfather wasn't a quarter black, he was fully black.
So Sargon claimed to be black. This way he was able to say, see, I'm not racist, I'm part black. Checkmate, SJWs. The problem is, he's clearly not black, and he blundered by showing a video of his parents playing a virtual reality video game. So he's tried to morph his past claim of my grandfather was black to my grandfather wasn't white. But how can he do this? Well, by saying Mediterraneans aren't white.
This is why the term white people is actually really not very useful and doesn't really describe many people outside of Northern Europe and their descendants. Need to explain why culture across white people, or people they consider to be white, not including Southern Europeans now I hope, suddenly now we're chucking out the Southern Europeans from being white. Mediterraneans aren't fucking white, okay?
This is subtle, but this is very different from saying defining white is problematic, or there are some edge cases in what is white. He's letting the audience know that he supposedly doesn't consider Southern Europeans white. This is a very strange and very particular view. And when you hang around in these circles for a long time, you know that this view is actually very, very rare. And the people who think this call themselves Nordicists. They are turbospurgs. And so when someone who claims that race doesn't really matter on the one hand, but then on the other hand takes a Nordicist definition of what is white, this is highly suspicious and irregular. Also, the context in which he said it seems forced, but that may just be my confirmation bias. Now, I don't think Sargon expects to actually win his race denial arguments or hold up against my or JF's criticisms. His purpose is to convince the audience that he doesn't consider Mediterraneans white, so that they don't think he was lying when he said his grandfather wasn't white, hoping to bypass the fact that he said further back that his grandfather was black. And so, I don't think Sargon actually believes the deconstructionist arguments he's making, which means the question in my clickbait title, is Sargon dumber than Kraut, will be answered right here near the beginning of the video, and that answer is no. If Sargon actually believed the arguments he was making, I would say he's dumber than Kraut, but I don't think he actually believes the argument he's making here. But with all that said, I feel obligated to actually respond to his arguments as presented at face value, so here we go.
As you can see, this is a map of haplogroups across Europe.
Yeah, well, here's another Y haplogroup map that you can look at. So you can look at this too. But haplogroups are just one aspect of ancestry, dependent on where you set the threshold for when one haplogroup begins and another one ends. A better way to look at race is with cluster analysis. And in this, self-reported race corresponds with best fit genetic clusters, somewhere between 93 and 99%. And I've done this a bunch. Go see the article linked in the description. Reference studies linked in line in the article. What these studies do basically is ask someone what their race is, then they give a computer a bunch of data and tell the computer to sort out the genetic data into a certain number of categories. And the computer is blind. The computer doesn't know what the self-identified race of the subjects are. It's not trying to force fit anything. And the result is a correspondence between 93 and 99% between self-identified race and these clusters. And the exceptions kind of prove the rule. They're like Hispanics and Southeast Asians who we already know are kind of mixed up. And this is just from when you ask a person their race. And sometimes people are going to give stupid answers or intentionally dishonest answers, like Sargon coming in saying I'm black, or Talcum X saying he's black. Though I would bet good money that if you took some of those old-timey racial heuristics and had professional scientific racists classify someone, it would line up with the genetic data at over 99%.
Unless, of course, swarthy, olive-skinned men are now white, in which case the entire Mediterranean, such as the Middle East, Egypt and North Africa, are also white people. This is why the term white people is actually really not very useful.
See, this is why I say dumber than Kraut, and this is just the continuum fallacy. Look, here's red and here's blue, clearly distinct colors. Oh, but you can put a continuum in there and see that they bleed into each other on the continuum. Well, I guess red and blue don't exist. This is literally you, Sargon. It's really tiring and dumb. I've been doing this for almost a decade, and I'll tell you how this works. Someone makes the continuum fallacy, I point out how it's stupid, and you either move off it or you burn. It's dumb, it's wrong, the audience can easily see that it's dumb and wrong. The best thing you can do after you make it is just take the L. The continuum fallacy, it's just a time sink. You make the argument sort of to harass, I blow it up, then you either burn or come off it. Now, knowing you, Sargon, you'll probably say, that's not exactly what I was saying. You don't understand what I was saying. I said it's somehow related to what I said about social constructs. Right, you'll try to pretzel your way out of it somehow. That's what you do, whatever. But I'm just pointing out the continuum fallacy. Now, Sargon of Akkad also has a bit of a hard-on for Assad.
Which is why if we take, say, a Greek man, say Alexis Tsipras, you can see that he doesn't look much like a Swedish man, like Dolph Lundgren. But he does look quite a lot like a Syrian man, such as Bashar al-Assad. In fact, Bashar al-Assad is whiter than Alexis Tsipras. So are Syrians now white people?
Now, Assad is a part of a group of Syrians known as the Alawites, and are distinct from most other people in the region in that they look all white. But I'm not sure what relevance this is supposed to have, even if Assad was representative of how all Syrians look. Like, what is this even supposed to mean? Let's say you look at their genome and said, oh, but they cluster in with Europeans. Okay, well then they cluster in with Europeans if they do. If not, then they don't. What if you had a bunch of people in the heart of India that looked like that were blondes? I don't know what that's supposed to even refute. Sargon trying to play up racial confusion is also why he likes to play up historical myths. The Irish weren't white myth.
Various, and then you've got people like the Irish who I don't think were white, at least initially, and it's just like, this is silly.
The Irish were considered by the US federal government to be white from the founding. We know this in two ways. The first is that the Irish were put on the census category white. The second is that the United States allowed Irish in when it had a white-only immigration policy, when whether or not you were white was a very serious thing. Now you can say you're white on the census and it doesn't matter, like anybody can say they're white. But back then, being white was determinant of citizenship, and there are actually court cases. There's a court case in California that determined that Indians, people from the subcontinent of India, not Native Americans, that they were not white and thus were not to be citizens, because at the time the US had a white-only citizenship policy, and around 20,000 Indians in the United States had their citizenship revoked and they were deported back to India. So being white, it's not like today. Something amazing that people will regurgitate is stuff from Harper's Weekly's little tabloid episode on the Irish. For example, they'll show this picture thinking it came from an anthropology journal, but it's actually just taking the piss out of the Irish. They're saying that the Irish were so ill-mannered, were so crude, that they were halfway to being downright African Americans. And that's pretty bad. That was the point of the magazine. Like, look at these Irish. Look at how crude and brash and uncouth they are. They're halfway to being downright African. I can just see in 100 years some brilliant historian saying that the alt-right didn't consider Italians or Irish white, referring to them as spaghetti nabbers or potato nabbers. Here are some mocking images of tracksuit, squatting Slav. Clearly, they didn't consider Slavs to be white. The Irish also earned about as much per capita as any other group. The Irish look very white, and hopefully Sargon recognizes that the Faulk taxonomy of race is based somewhat on superficial appearance. So if you want to say that people didn't consider these people, the Irish, white, well, that's kind of a claim, Sargon, and you're going to need a lot more than just the fact that some people didn't like the Irish. But what's even more amazing is Sargon's line about how
it's not helpful for them. They've found themselves trapped in a position where they have to now define. I mean, Mexicans are white. Japanese are white.
Now, I had to do a double take on this. Does Sargon not know what Hispanics are or how Hispanics work? And as for the Japanese are white, is he talking about the Ainu? Is he doing that dumb thing? Now, I don't know what his argument is specifically, as there are branching paths of what he could actually mean or what the actual impact of his arguments of Mexicans are white and Japanese are white, what they could all be, but they're all stupid. The Ainu could possibly fool the old Faulk taxonomy on first contact, but guess what? They didn't fool them, I don't know, maybe after 20 years, Europeans came to be aware that the Ainu were not like them. Obviously, the Ainu would not fool the genetic data. They would not cluster in Europeans on that count. And over time, the differences between the genetic tendencies and behavior between the Europeans and Ainu eventually became so apparent. This is similar to how the Papuans and Australian Aborigines were thought to be related to Africans on first contact until the Europeans spent enough time around them to be aware of the behavioral differences, that Australians and Papuans behaved very differently from sub-Saharan Africans. And they were classified as a separate race from the Africans very shortly after first contact, and today we know that the Abos and the Black Africans are the most genetically distant relationship between any two of the major clusters if K is equal to 7 or 9. So not only are the Papua New Guineans and Australian Aborigines genetically distinct from Africans that they cluster into a separate cluster, it is the most distant relationship between any two clusters when you use 7 or 9 clusters. Now, Sargon could be arguing regarding the Hispanics that even fully Spanish people from Latin America aren't European because Spain isn't European. Therefore, the Mexicans being considered white is a great affront to the idea of a genetic white race, because he doesn't consider Spaniards to be white, so he doesn't consider Mexico to have any white admixture because Spanish doesn't count as white. Do you see how this all sort of interconnects in a very stupid way? So I don't know what Sargon didn't properly impact his argument. So maybe Sargon's trying to inject some confusion and make you think that you're confused about what Hispanics are, and your confusion about what Hispanics are means there's confusion about what whites are because Southern Europeans aren't white. He would have to impact this argument and fully flesh it out, but there's all sorts of branching paths for what this could possibly mean. But whatever it really means, Sargon's on crazy train on this. I guess he could also be arguing that the US Census category allows Hispanics to pick any race, and they usually pick white if they pick any race at all. But this makes sense given that the whole genome of Latin America is about 56% European. But I'll tell you this, if I were to do a parody video of Sargon before seeing this video of Sargon making very bad but Sargon-esque arguments, I would not have Sargon what he said. I would not have Sargon say, well, what even is white? After all, supposedly the Japanese are white and Mexicans are white. I wouldn't have him say that because that's just too on the nose. It's just too over the top stupid, even for parody, but that's what he said. So I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it with my own 2 eyes or hear it. And again, I want to reiterate, I don't actually think Sargon is this stupid. I think he's doing all of this just because of his black grandpa gambit, and that he's not really this stupid. But the thing is, that's established. That Sargon lied about being part black, that happened, that's true, and he's trying to shell game it into non-white, and trying to shell game that into, I think Southern Europeans aren't white. That this happened is not really a debate point at this point. The question now is Sargon trying to cover up for that lie by trying to convince you that he doesn't consider Southern European white, and of all these deconstructing the white race nostrums? Is that what he's trying to do? Or does he honest to God believe these really, really bad arguments? So the question is Is he a liar trying to cover up his lie? Or is he a liar but also really, really stupid? Now, notice none of these games are played when whites are attacked. When whites are being attacked, everyone knows exactly what a white person is. It's only when whites are trying to organize against the attacks that you start getting this, what exactly is white game? It's only when attacking the alt-right, a label that I'm sad is stuck, that you get this white deconstructionism. And even Sargon is doing this. When SJWs attack whites, Sargon responds to them in the real world. He doesn't respond to the SJWs with, well, how do you even know what white is? Because he's not that retarded, at least in that context. I think it's also important to note that the groups Jew and the groups Hispanic, those two groups are far more nebulous than white. Hispanic, is that speak Spanish? Is that from Spain? Is that a racial thing? Is there a racial component to Hispanic? Same with Jewish. What is Jewish? Is that a religion? Is that an ethnicity? Is it a biological race? And the thing about Jewish is that we know, yeah, it's kind of complicated. It's kind of all those things. It's kind of a fuzzy set, but we basically know what a Jew is, and we basically know what a Hispanic is. If you ask somebody to really strictly define what is a Jew or what is a Hispanic, they will struggle. The definition of white is far clearer than either of those, and we can actually come up with a fairly concrete genetic definition that overlays with the Faulk taxonomy around 99% of the time. But yet that is the one being deconstructed, not Hispanic and not Jewish. So that should tell you about a little bit of the hypocrisy and the bad faith of deconstructing what is white.
And honestly, I do think this is something we should reject wholesale from the Americans.
South Africa recognizes race, and they have a concept of white. Canada recognizes white. The UK recognizes white. Brazil recognizes white. Brazilians think about race in the exact same way everyone else on the planet does, not the retarded census categories. So please, people, don't bring up the stupid Brazilian census crap. That's not how Brazilians think. I have studies on that. Please don't waste time making that argument. We don't need that time sink. When the Japanese and Indians see a white person, which I contend exists, they don't have to be conditioned into an idea about race or whatever the fuck. They see the person. They see that they look very European. And then over time, they see the behavior. They see the manner. They see the way they walk. The brain is very good at seeing patterns in behavior. It's immediate. It's obvious. Ancient Egyptians saw the races in their region similar to how we would see the races in their region. Light-skinned people from Greece and Italy, which we now have genetic data showing that this corroborates. This corroborates the idea that the people in that region were lighter skinned back then than they are today, sadly. And then they have brown-skinned people in Egypt and the Levant and Arabia, and the black Africans with the big noses in Nubia, or modern-day Sudan. So no, they saw race the same way we see race today. It's not an American thing. It's a not being a fucking mouth-breathing shit-eater thing. And even if it were an American thing, as Sargon likes to contend, which I don't think is the case, but even if that were the case, then I would tell you to shut up and swallow this bit of American sanity.
The construct of white people is just lazy, and it was used in America to differentiate between the slave class and the ruling class. But actually reading what social justice warriors actually believe, read their source material, and you can understand this.
This is straight up oppression narrative pig shit. Sargon is going full SJW, at least in this limited context. That race, as we see it today, was recognized before slavery and contemporaneously independent of the Atlantic slave trade, with more than just Africans, but people recognized the Chinese and people from India and the Arab world who were not slaves, and even on first contact with black Africans long before the Atlantic slave trade. All that is just established. It's just true. We just know that race, as we conceive of it today, was recognized well before the Atlantic slave trade. Sargon is wrong, so this retarded Marxoid idea that race was invented to justify slavery, we're going to put this in the same dumpster that we put the glorified shit test known as feminist theory in. It's just dumb, it's wrong, and it's just going to be hand-waved away. Sargon then brings up the notion of race as a social construct.
Now this is an important distinction, because the white race is a social construct. The phrase, the white race, that in itself is a social construct. It is not a description of the genetic makeup of white people. Let me explain. I personally don't think that the term black people is very useful either. During the Rwandan genocide, there was no appeal to the wider blackness of the Tutsi and the Hutu. It was just two different groups of people who shared a similar skin tone.
So he's getting cute. He says that he deconstructs the black race too. No, you don't, Sargon. You'll say, oh, this all applies to the black race too, but you only ever mention the black race not being real in the context of deconstructing whites in order to appear consistent. Your goal is to deconstruct whites, and you mention, oh, this applies to black people too, just to seem consistent when you're deconstructing whites, which is the only group you do a targeted deconstruction of. Now, maybe in response to me actually saying this to you, you will actually do a little dance and make a video about deconstructing some other race other than whites, just to appear that you're actually really going after some other race's identity, not just whites. Like, at that point, it would obviously just be an act even if you did that. Now, as for the term social construct, this is again Sargon drifting off into his world of forms, getting caught up on language and symbol manipulation, getting trapped in the language itself, instead of seeing that language is just a very crude tool to describe the world. The purpose of language is to convey meaning to another person. And you want to be precise to a degree. I do believe that sloppy language leads to sloppy thought, but we need to remember that language is just meant to convey meaning. It's not a mathematical formula. And whenever Sargon, in the way philosophers like to use social construct, sure, race is a social construct, but so is species. So is the concept of a chair or a table. What's the difference between a chair and a table? Is this a chair? Is this a table? How do you define the two? What's the difference between a car and a truck? You can come up with some hard definition if you want, but what if someone doesn't agree with your definition, right? You can play all those stupid little games forever and say, and everything's a social construct. And that's true. In the way philosophy people use the word social construct, Sargon is correct. Sargon is right in that race is a social construct in the way philosophers use the term. So whatever, buddy, but in practice, when you say race is a social construct, that is meant to convey a lack of biological reality to race. And it's based on what a layman thinks of when he hears the words social construct. So the person saying race is a social construct goes, oh, I just mean social construct in the philosophical sense, knowing full well what the layman is going to think when he hears the words social construct. It's a definitional bait and switch. He's using a philosophical definition of social construct, knowing full well that what the layman thinks of when he hears social construct is something totally different. So you can say, oh, I'm not lying, but conveying an alternative meaning to the layman because he knows that the layman interprets social construct differently than the well-versed philosopher. And Richard keeps telling you this, and you get mad, Sargon, because you think it's just an ad hominem, but it's actually advice that you should heed, Sargon. You're not smart enough to be doing all these little tricks. In American football, or hand egg, as I'm sure you like to call it, I see players all the time who love to do all sorts of neat jukes and tricky moves in high school, like all sorts of spin moves and swim moves, and they run the ball into the end zone. And they like to make the defenders miss the tackle, and they're real stars in high school for doing all this stuff. And then when they get into college, if you try to do all that crap, you try to be cute with all sorts of little spins and jukes and all that stuff, here's what's going to happen. You're going to spend a lot of time dancing in the backfield behind the line of scrimmage, and you're going to be tackled for loss. In college, coaches are constantly trying to drill running backs to stop dancing around in the backfield and just run, hit them, keep the legs moving forward, and gain a yard or two after contact. And I think there's a parallel between what's going on with Sargon. So in Sargon, dealing with the SJWs, that was sort of the equivalent of playing high school hand egg, where he could do all these fancy jukes and swim moves and get all the touchdowns from just being so fast. But now he's arguing with the alt-right. That's kind of like going from high school to college. He's trying to do all these cute little moves, and you're just going to get punished for it if you try to do this. So don't do this. Just run straight, run parallel, try to get a yard or two after you get hit. Don't do all these little tricks. Don't do all these little games. Just play square up. Because if you do a little trick, we're all going to see it and call it out immediately. And you could say, oh, ad hominem. This is actually good advice that you should heed. Now, what's amazing is that Sargon actually has a line to the alt-right. He has a line to Richard Spencer. He has a line to Mike Enoch. He even has a line to Andrew Anglin, however you want to classify Andrew Anglin. I see Anglin as a halfway house between alt-right and full-on Spurg. And on the other end of the spectrum, Sargon has a line to Jared Taylor. But however you classify Anglin, Sargon has a line to him. And for the YouTube crew, Sargon has a line to Millennial Woes, to me, to Tara, to Braving Ruin, to JF, whether or not you consider JF alt-right. It doesn't really matter how we define alt-right. We can argue that till the end of time, because whatever it is, Sargon has spoken to all of it. And this paralysis over what is white that Sargon keeps bringing up as a great fear that's going to happen, this is not happening among the people he actually talks to, who represent like all of the alt-right. So it's like Sargon is telling someone who doesn't have an issue over what is white that he's going to have an issue over what is white, and that's going to be a major problem in the future. And what Sargon mainly refers to is all these forum critter nordicists, and how you're going to have to deal with these forum critter nordicists. How about not? How about we don't have to deal with them? On top of it, many countries have had white-only immigration policies, including the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK. South Africa had race-based citizenship. And I'm sure you can dig through the records and you can find some arguments at the time that they had about what constituted whites, but it's always a very marginal edge case thing that was happening here. And Sargon can find, oh look, there were debates in South Africa at this point in time over what constituted white. Therefore, the ethno-state won't work because you're going to have to define what white is at some point, right? It's just vapid. I can totally see Sargon doing that. Sargon either doesn't realize or forgot, or what I think he's pretending to not realize, is that the ethno-state is not conceptual. Sargon is treating what was the norm for most of human history, the norms under which the global industrial revolution occurred and life as we know it up from feudalism was created. He's treating this very real, very proven thing as something highly conceptual.
Cultural and national identities, ethnic identities, are far more concrete than racial identities.
So Sargon claims that nationality is more concrete than race. Now, if Sargon means in a strictly legal sense, maybe. Because all countries have race categories, and you're marked as one, and someone can just choose to mark another race, and most governments just accept whatever you say on the form. Not always, but most of the time, and especially in the United States today, what you say on the form is what race you are. So you can also change your nationality in a legal sense, but there's a whole process to go through with that. So in that sense, sure, nationality is more concrete than race in terms of what it is you write down on these forms and what you're legally recognized as in certain circumstances. However, if you're talking in real terms, like actually becoming biologically another race, that almost never happens. And when someone tries to do it, they're laughed at. The legal category of race is malleable because it doesn't affect your taxes, at least not yet, while the country you're in does affect tax payments. So that's a bit more difficult to change, and there's more of a process there. People can change what country they're a citizen of, and that's treated as okay, totally acceptable, makes sense. But when you try to change your race, when you try to be transracial, that's retarded, and you're a joke. It's not as race, in the biological sense, is not as malleable as nationality. Sargon also engaged in some ghost busting regarding race and culture.
And ideas. To say that religion doesn't shape culture is ludicrous to me. But you can't suggest that religion is biologically innate, a certain kind of religion. Otherwise, how did the West ever become Christianized, and how did the East ever become Islamized?
Yeah, nobody says this. You're arguing with yourself, Sargon. The heritability of your specific religion is almost zero, and the heritability of your specific language is almost zero in a very individualistic sense. But think about Ebonics versus how white people talk. A white person often has to have things repeated and slowed down because he doesn't understand the dialect of Ebonics or Black English very well. So you have Europeans and Africans, each raised to learn what is nominally the same language, English, and yet they speak it very differently. Blacks who live more apart from whites, right, in the ghetto or in the rural South, they speak more of this Black English dialect and less of the way white people speak English. And given how languages evolve over time, imagine if Europeans and Africans were made to live apart for 500 years, how different the languages would become. What is the pull of their genetic mesh? Another example would be the behavior of Japanese in Brazil and the United States versus Japanese in Japan. Now, we consider ancestrally Japanese or Manchurian, Korean, Han Chinese, Cantonese, it doesn't really matter. That genetic cluster in the United States and Brazil, we consider those people to be very quiet and be very mild-mannered. However, in Japan, when these immigrants go back to Japan from either the United States or Brazil, they're considered to be a little bit rude. They're considered to be a little bit, maybe not rude, but a little bit curt or forward, we'll say. Because when you put a bunch of Northeast Asian people on an island in the middle of the ocean, what happens is their already existing genetic tendencies pulls their behavior and norms in a different direction. Now, blacks in the United States, they tend to be more violent, they tend to be more shiftless relative to the whites, but they're not outright feral like they are in Chad or the Central African Republic or those places. There's that pull of the genetic mesh. And I've talked about this genetic mesh before, and it's important to look at the world this way because that's how things actually work, not this trinket individualism. And I've said this a bunch, but you have actual genetic correlates with collectivism and social sensitivity, and these vary by race. There are also genetic correlates with support for free speech, and these have predictive validity within races as well, which means we're not just looking at a correlation with the genes that influence skin color, for example. And all this stuff appears to manifest in political differences between races within the same country. Blacks in the US vote for third world policies, blacks in the UK vote for third world policies. But these differences are, by all evidence, extended further when these racial groups have their own countries. Right now, you see major political differences between the races in the UK and the US, while whites still dominate the culture. When whites don't dominate the culture, you can expect a genetic mesh pull. Africa versus African Americans. Japanese versus Japanese Americans. California is an example of this, the result being that the Hispanics in California are even less Republican than the Hispanics in the rest of the US are. California is being carved out as a Hispanic space, kept in line from total insanity only by federal supremacy. There was a serious proposition in California to tax savings, and what this means is that they will take a proportion of the value of your current bank balance, literally taking your bank balance out of your bank account every year. Now, without federal supremacy stopping it, which they would, I think California would do it. Hispanics in Texas or Florida wouldn't propose something like this, but they do in California, and that's apparently an effect of the genetic mesh. Because it's all Hispanic all the time in California, they're not moderated by the culture of whites, of the culture that comes from the genetics of whites. They're just amongst themselves, and when they're amongst themselves and they have full democracy, they create things like Bolivia and Venezuela. And in order to prevent spiraling off into something like Venezuela, an autocratic elite has to run everything, and they have to be very undemocratic because otherwise it'll just go off the rails. And that's why Latin America is so autocratic, because it sort of has to be, because these people don't vote for civilization. Sargon then likes to point to changes in culture in response to changes in technology or events over time. It's intuitive. You have genetic tendencies expressed in a circumstance, and these circumstances change for all sorts of reasons. When the circumstance changes, the same genes produce a different phenotype. What's so hard about this? You have races forming these interlocking, massively redundant genetic meshes that express themselves differently in different environments, and different races form different genetic meshes even within the same environment. Maybe I should dumb it down to make Sargon's fallacy a bit easier to understand. Instead of whole races, let's take the individual. William the White and Bob the Black. In environment A, William the White gets in 1 fight per year, Bob gets in 11 fights per year. In environment B, William would get in 5 fights per year, Bob gets in 55. And this difference in getting in fights, of course, represents every other personality trait. Now, if William and Bob are allowed to create their own environments, William will tend toward environment A, Bob will tend toward environment B, within the context of whatever technology exists in their place and time. So their already existing genetic differences gets extended further. Coming back up to present time, we can think about the political views of Africans. How they manifest in Britain is going to be different from how they manifest in Haiti, Jamaica, or Cameroon. So it's simplest to think about people as having genetic tendencies or genetic biases, one of which is a genetically ingrained bias to listen to your genetic similars. And certain technology can change. A king can, say, win a war and change church doctrine, or have a cultural revolution that changes a bunch of laws that affect the way people live and act. So you can't have these shock pop-off effects, but you also have these long genetic mesh pulls. And it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. So are race differences in language a result of genetic differences? Well, it's complicated. Sure, the religion that you as as an individual believe in is that which you got from your parents. So in a very narrow sense, we can say that the heritability of your specific religion is nearly zero. But Islam spread amongst the Arabs, not amongst the white Europeans. The doctrine of Islam appears to have been more appealing to the Arab genotype than to the European genotype. And I predict Islam will displace Christianity within Africa eventually. In Europe, something like Islam did not originate. Well, actually, there's quite a bit of evidence for there having been a major genetic change that caused Europeans, especially North and West Europeans, to be much less violent than they are today. Recorded homicide certainly went down, and there are several mechanisms that we have a pretty good idea selected against violence and impulsivity. One was the war on murder, where about 1.5% of the male population was executed for committing a violent crime every generation. The other was upper classes genetically replacing the lower classes due to differences in surviving offspring. And there was the manor system, which selected for people willing to put off marriage and willing to marry outside of their clan. And today, clans don't really exist among Europeans anymore, whereas when Rome was advancing through Gaul and Germany, there were lots of clans. I explained this in more detail in my video, The European Revolution, and even more detail in articles talking about this, so I'm not going to go over that here. It's just to point out that you shouldn't always confuse a substantial change in behavior in what seems like a short time or an environmental effect when it could very well be a result of a genetic change. And this is your problem, Sargon. What's actually happening is that you don't understand your opposition. And so you put forth this harebrained straw man that I believe that specific language and religion at the individual level are a function of one's genes. And I can just hear Sargon right now going, oh, not you, alternative hypothesis. The alt-right thinks this vague, nebulous alt-right. But again, Sargon, the alt-right isn't this nebulous thing. It's like 10 guys who represent 90% of the whole show, all of whom you've talked to, and none of them say the specific language or specific religion are genetically determined at the individual level. Whenever Sargon says the alt-right thinks X, ask him who, because Sargon is in a rather privileged position that he has a line to everyone. He doesn't have to generalize about this stuff because the alt-right isn't some nebulous thing for him. It's real people who he has talked to and can talk to again whenever he wants to on fairly short notice, which makes Sargon's errors all the less forgivable. If some rando commenter claimed the alt-right thinks language and religion are determined by genes, that would be bad for him saying that, because I would know that this rando is talking out of his ass and doesn't care about who he mischaracterizes and doesn't care to do the research before making an attack on someone. Sargon, having talked to all these people and having been fixated on the alt-right for so long and having had this platform where getting this properly sorted out is actually his full-time job, it's all much less forgivable. At best, he's being extremely cavalier about what other people believe, doing almost no research before ascribing ridiculous positions to them. At worst, he's consciously lying, and I think he's consciously lying. But pick your poison, Sargon, stupid or dishonest. So that was a really long video. It's a real hot mess and maybe a bit overwhelming for some to listen to, but yeah, Sargon's really bad at this, and it's hard to tell what he actually believes and what he's saying that he knows is false.